So today we're going to talk about Imperial China, and we're going to be looking at events that are unfolding in China at the same time as some of the things we talked about earlier, for example, the Age of Exploration. So just bear that in mind as I talk, that we're looking at China right here, but over in Western Europe you've got the Age of Exploration ongoing, you've got the Protestant Reformation, and so forth. So here's the terms. Take a moment, write them down, make sure you get them all, and we will cover them. I've mentioned before that Western Europe was cut off from the outside world after the fall of Rome in 476. The Crusades began in 1095, and for the first time we see Western Europeans starting to venture out, travel over to the east. Along with the crusading knights went merchants, and they opened trade networks. Well, one of those merchants was Marco Polo. In 1271, he and his father and his uncle traveled from Italy, where they were from. They were Italian. They were from Venice. They traveled from Italy over to China and spent more than 20 years living there. And when they returned to Italy, a book was written about Marco Polo's journey, of his travels and his time in China. And it became a bestseller, and it spurred interest in the Orient because he told about these amazing, wonderful things that Europeans had never heard of. Things like government-sponsored mail service and coals, these black rocks that could heat an entire room. Europeans had never heard of such things, and they were intrigued. And so Marco Polo is important because he gave people a glimpse into what was out there, and in doing that he spurred interest in the Orient. So how do the Chinese first come into contact with outside world, with the Europeans? Well, in 1514, a Portuguese fleet dropped anchor off the coast of China. It was the first direct contact between the Chinese Empire and Europe since the journeys of Marco Polo 200 years earlier. This event began an era that would eventually change the face of China and eventually all of Europe. At the time, the Chinese thought little of the Portuguese arrival. The Ming Dynasty had ended its overseas explorations in the mid-1400s, and Confucian officials had little use for foreigners. So here you see the Ming Dynasty, the territory being controlled at that time, and you see the years of the dynasty from 1369 to 1644. And what had happened was the Ming Dynasty, as I said, they ended their overseas explorations. They even burned their fleet of ships. They had built a huge fleet of ships, cost a lot of money, and they burned them because they didn't want to really have much contact with the outside world. A Ming document states, quote, "Since our empire owns the world, there is no country on this or other sides of the seas which does not submit to us." Well, when the Portuguese arrived in 1514, they didn't seem to have a lot to offer in exchange for Chinese silks and porcelains. And this is the first contact that the Chinese have had with outsiders for about a century almost. And so they're kind of forced to open their doors when the Portuguese arrive. And as I just said, they're not real impressed with what the Portuguese have to offer. European textiles, metalwork, and other goods just seem to be inferior to Chinese products. China appeared to be at the height of its power as the most magnificent civilization on the face of the earth. Here you see another view, and China's empire at this time, when the Portuguese arrived, stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the China Sea, from the Gobi Desert to the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia. And from the lofty perspective of the imperial throne in Beijing, the Europeans were just seen as kind of an unusual form of barbarian. In fact, The Chinese called the Portuguese the Southern Barbarians, who, like other foreigners, lacked the civil ways of the Chinese. And they were called Southern Barbarians because Southern, they sailed in from the south. Barbarians, as I just said, they lacked the civilized ways of the Chinese. In fact, there was a dinner party at one point where, and we'll see the same thing happen in Japan, but there was a dinner party where European officials were invited, and the Chinese were pretty horrified by the table manners, or lack of, by the Europeans. They didn't know what napkins were. They ate with their fingers. They had food encrusted in their beards. They wiped their dirty mouths with their sleeves and then ate with food-encrusted sleeves. And the Chinese, who were a clean people, were pretty appalled. To the Chinese ruler, the rulers of all other countries were simply younger brothers of the Chinese emperor, and the emperor himself was viewed as the son of heaven. Now, like I mentioned a few moments ago, Marco Polo had first aroused European interest in China in the late 13th century. Rumors of a great society in the East grew as other travelers made their way along what was called the Silk Road, which was a major trade route between the East and the West. And it was those tales of riches of the East that spurred Columbus and other adventurers to go and try to find a sea route to China. By the time the Portuguese fleet arrived off the coast of China, the Ming Dynasty had begun a new era of greatness in Chinese history. Under a series of strong rulers, China extended its rule into Mongolia and Central Asia, and you see that on this map that you're looking at. The Ming even briefly reconquered Vietnam, which China had ruled a couple of centuries prior. Along the northern frontier, they strengthened the Great Wall of China, which had actually been started around 220 BC. And they made peace with the nomadic tribes who had troubled China for centuries. The achievements of the Ming rulers at home were equally impressive. They ran an effective government by making use of the centralized bureaucracy, staffed with officials chosen by the civil service examination system. And so what that means is that if you were living in China at this time and you wanted to work for the government, you had to take a civil service examination. This had been part of their culture for centuries, and it's a test that you had to take to prove that you're qualified to do the job. And students, young men, actually studied for this examination for years while in school. Under the Ming rulers, China saw a huge increase in manufactured goods produced in workshops and factories. New crops were introduced, which greatly expanded food production. One of those crops was the potato. Once the age of exploration begins, the potato will make its way eventually to China and become one of the staple food items. At the beginning of the 15th century, China seemed ready to open itself up to the wider world. Huge fleets of Chinese ships traveled as far west as the eastern coast of Africa. But fighting among people at court undermined the influence of those who favored the project, and in 1433 the policy was reversed. Although Chinese ships would continue to sail the South China Sea, they were privately owned, so we're not seeing government-sponsored ships, and they would no longer sail into the open sea. This was forbidden. An early European visitor reported that, quote, "No one sails the sea from north to south. It is prohibited by the king, in order that the country may not become known." The Chinese wish to remain unknown was shattered when the Portuguese arrived in 1514. And the Portuguese very quickly outraged Chinese officials with their behavior, and they were expelled from the mainland. And at that time, the Chinese began to call the Portuguese ocean devils. The Portuguese negotiated with the Chinese, and finally they reached a compromise where the Portuguese were allowed to occupy a tiny territory called Macau, and this was to be their base of operations. And at first, the Portuguese arrival did not have a huge impact on Chinese society. Direct trade between Europe and China was limited. Portuguese ships became involved in the regional trade network, though, carrying Chinese silk to Japan in return for Japanese silver. And quite often, the Europeans made a poor impression on their hosts. Niccolo Minucci was an Italian traveler, and he went to China, traveled throughout, and he told how the Asians, the Chinese, thought that Europeans, quote, have no polite manners, that they are ignorant, wanting in ordered life, and very dirty. Europeans, by contrast, wrote enthusiastically about China. In 1590, a visitor described Chinese artisans, quote, cleverly making devices out of gold, silver, and other metals. He was also very impressed with their industries and wrote, quote, their industry appears in the making of guns and gunpowder, whereof there are many rare fireworks. To these may be added the art of printing. Although their letters are many and most difficult, they daily publish huge multitudes of books. More important than trade, though, was the exchange of ideas. Christian missionaries had also made the long voyage to China on European merchant ships. The Jesuits were among the most active and the most effective. Many of the early Jesuit missionaries to China were highly educated men who were familiar with scientific developments. They brought along clocks and various other instruments that impressed Chinese officials and made the officials more open to Western ideas. The Jesuits used this openness to promote Christianity. To make it easier for the Chinese to accept Christianity, the Jesuits pointed to similarities between Christian morality and Confucian ethics. The Italian priest Matteo Ricci traveled to China. He was actually one of the founders of the Christian movement in China, one of the first missionaries, and he spent many years traveling through and working in China, converting the Chinese to Christianity. And he described the Jesuit approach. He wrote, quote, in order that the appearance of a new religion might not arouse suspicion among the Chinese people, the Jesuit fathers did not speak openly about religious matters when they began to appear in public. They do, however, try to teach this pagan people in a more direct way, namely by virtue of their example and by the sanctity of their lives. In this way, they attempted to win the goodwill of the people, and little by little to dispose their minds to receive what they could not be persuaded to accept by word of mouth. From the time of their entrance, they wore the ordinary Chinese outer garment, which was somewhat similar to their own religious habits, a long robe reaching down to the heels, and with very ample sleeves, which are much in favor with the Chinese. And so you can compare this to the Jesuits who were working in New France in North America. I read a quote when we talked about the age of exploration of a Jesuit priest describing how they worked with the Native Americans. They came to them where they were, basically. They learned their language, adopted their customs, and so forth. And this was a very successful tactic. It worked well for the Jesuits in the New World. It worked well for the Jesuits in China. Ricci learned to speak Chinese and adopted the Chinese dress. His goal was to convert upper-class Chinese to Christianity, and he hoped that they, in turn, would spread Christian teachings to the rest of China. He was really successful in winning friends among the scholar gentry by sharing his knowledge of the arts and sciences of Renaissance Europe. The Chinese were fascinated by new European technologies, things like maps. They were also open to European discoveries in astronomy and mathematics. But while Chinese rulers welcomed Ricci and other Jesuits for their learning, the priests had little success spreading their religious beliefs, when you look at the big picture. In the end, though, both sides did benefit from this early cultural exchange. Chinese scholars marveled at their ability to read better with things like European eyeglasses. Christian missionaries were very impressed with many aspects of Chinese civilization, things like the teachings of Confucius, Chinese pottery, and Chinese architecture. Reports back home from these Chinese missionaries soon made Europeans even more curious about the great civilization on the other side of the world. The days of the Ming Dynasty were numbered. They achieved a period of greatness, and then, after a period of prosperity and growth, the Ming gradually began to decline. During the late 16th century, that's the 1500s, a series of weak rulers led to a period of government corruption. The inflow of huge amounts of foreign silver in return for Chinese products led to an alarming increase in inflation. Then, the arrival of the Dutch and English disrupted the silver trade. Silver imports dropped, severely straining the Chinese economy. Crop yields declined because of harsh weather. Higher taxes, caused in part by official corruption, led to peasant unrest and worker violence in urban areas. And as always, internal problems in China went hand in hand with unrest along the northern frontier. The Ming had tried to come to terms with the frontier tribes by making alliances with them, because you have China, and then beyond the boundaries of China were all these various tribal people, some of whom had over the years tried to invade, and so that's why the Chinese made alliances. Well, one of the alliances was with a tribe called the Manchus, and the Manchus were a mixed farming and hunting people. They lived northeast of the Great Wall in the area known today as Manchuria, and you can see it on this map up in the top right-hand corner of the pink area. At first, the Manchus were content in their own lands, and they made very little effort to extend their rule south of the Great Wall. But as the 17th century progressed, the Manchus were tempted to invade as the problems of the Ming Dynasty came to a head. In the 1630s, a major epidemic greatly reduced the population in many areas of the country. Quote, "There were few signs of human life in the streets, and all that was heard was the buzzing of the flies." And this is because of the epidemic. The streets were piled with bodies. The suffering stretched throughout China. Because there was so much suffering brought on by this epidemic, we see it helping to spark a peasant revolt. And the revolt was led by a Chinese man named Li Zizheng. He was a postal worker in central China, and as a cost-saving measure by the imperial court, he had been fired from his job. So does that sound familiar? We see things like that happening today, layoffs. And he was really upset about it, as were many of the other men who had been laid off from their jobs. As a result, in the 1640s, Li Zizheng started this revolt, as I said, and he enlarged the revolt to extend throughout the entire country, so it was no longer just centralized in his area. And in 1644, he and his forces occupied the capital of Beijing. The last Ming emperor committed suicide by hanging himself from a tree in the palace gardens because he believed that he had lost power, he had lost everything. And so Li Zizheng came in and seized control, but only for a short moment. And that's because the overthrow of the Ming Dynasty created a power vacuum, and it created an opening for the Manchus. With the help of quite a few of the Ming military commanders who deserted, the Manchus were able to come in and conquer Beijing. Li Zizhang's army just fell apart, and the Manchus then came in and took over. The Manchus took over, and they declared the creation of a new dynasty called the Qin dynasty, and this meant pure. Well, once again, China was under foreign rule, as it had been several times in its past. This dynasty, the Qin dynasty, is to be the last imperial dynasty. To preserve their distinct identity, the Manchus barred quite a few customs that had just been commonplace in China. For example, they barred intermarriage between Manchus and Chinese. They also banned the practice of foot binding. Manchu women were forbidden to follow this traditional Chinese practice. And this was an especially painful symbol of a woman's role in society and of her subordination. This is a practice that had gone on for many, many centuries. The feet of female infants were often deliberately deformed by a binding process that not only was exceedingly painful, but also distorted the bones and hindered walking for life. And it originally began to prevent women from wandering and being unfaithful to their husbands. Over a period of time, though, small feet came to be considered especially attractive. For example, you might read a poem written by a poet who's comparing a woman's foot to a small lily. And it became a status symbol of sorts among the upper class women. Basically the idea being that you don't need to walk because you are of a high enough class where you can afford to pay people to do things for you. An estimated 1/2 to 2/3 of the females in China were subjected to this practice. Peasant women were often spared, though not always, especially in rice-growing regions, because they were needed as laborers. They were needed to work out in the fields. And this practice continued. It was not legally prohibited until the creation of the first Chinese Republic at the beginning of the 20th century. At first, the Chinese resisted the new rulers because their policies were just so ruthless, and they were totally insensitive to Chinese customs. When rebels, for example, seized the island of Taiwan, which was about 90 miles off the coast of China, the new Manchu government evacuated the entire coastline across from the island in preparation for an attack on the rebels. So they didn't mess around. The Manchus basically sent the message, look, you don't mess with us, we mean business, we say you need to do something, you do it. And in fact, to make it easier to identify the rebels, the government also ordered all Chinese males to adopt a Manchu dress and hairstyle. And that meant that all Chinese males had to shave their foreheads and braid their hair in pigtails. Those who refused were executed. As a popular saying of the time put it, lose your hair or lose your head. There were two Qin monarchs who ruled China for well over 100 years, from the middle of the 17th century to the end of the 18th century. And this is Kangxi and Qianlong. They were responsible for a lot of the greatness of Manchu China. So let's look at Kangxi. Kangxi ruled from 1661 to 1722, and he was perhaps the greatest ruler in Chinese history. He came to the throne at the age of 7, and initially he ruled with advisors, but he took charge of the government while he was still a teenager, and ended up reigning for 61 years. He was blessed with diligence and political skill and a very strong character. And he was a very dedicated ruler. He would get up at dawn every day and work until very late into the night. His goal was just to see to the betterment of his country. He once wrote, "One act of negligence may cause sorrow all through the country, and one moment of negligence may result in trouble for hundreds and thousands of generations." And if you think about that, that's true. We see that in our day. Well, Kanchi claimed or calmed the unrest along the northern and western frontiers by force. He was an active patron of the arts and letters, and he gained the support of scholars all throughout China. And all in all, he made the Qin dynasty acceptable to the Chinese people. Now, during his reign, the efforts of the Christian missionaries, the Jesuits, and also Dominicans and Franciscans reached their height. Kanchi was pretty tolerant of the Christians, and several hundred officials actually became Catholics, as did an estimated 300,000 ordinary Chinese. Ultimately, though, the Christian effort was undermined by fighting among the religious orders themselves. To make it easier for the Chinese to convert to Catholicism, the Jesuits had allowed the new Catholics to continue the practice of ancestor worship, which was something that had been practiced in China for many, many centuries. Well, they gained a lot of converts as a result, and the Dominicans and the Franciscans, they had fewer converts and they were jealous. So they complained to the Pope. The Pope responded by condemning the practice. And so this is going on while Kanchi's emperor, and he was pretty tolerant of it. But then after he died, his successor began to suppress Christian activities all throughout China. Qianlong was Kanchi's grandson, and he ruled from 1735 to 1796. And you might notice that he actually ruled for 61 years, as did his grandfather. There's a reason for this. Qianlong actually abdicated in his 61st year of reigning because he said that his grandfather was the greatest emperor China had ever had, and there was no way he could ever surpass that. And so he wanted to step down when he reached the same length of time that his grandfather had ruled. And he also is considered to be an outstanding Qin ruler. Like Kanchi, his grandfather, Qianlong was known for his diligence, his tolerance, and his intellectual curiosity. He also used vigorous military action against the restless tribes along the frontier. His efforts to promote economic prosperity and administrative efficiency and artistic excellence won the approval of a lot of the Chinese people. The result was continued growth for the Manchu Empire throughout much of the 18th century. Under both of these emperors, the Chinese economy expanded. There's new crops coming in from the Americas, things like corn and potatoes, and these boosted farm input, and this also contributed to a population boom. China's population rose from 140 million in 1740 to over 300 million by 1800, and that's a huge increase in a very short period of time. Peace and prosperity also contributed to the further growth of the country, as well as growth in handicraft industries, including things like silk and cotton and porcelain. Internal trade grew, as did the demand for Chinese goods from all over the world. One reason for the success of the Manchus was their ability to adapt to Chinese conditions, because these were outsiders. They came in, they took over, and they had to find a way to work with the people they're ruling, their new subjects. The Qin maintained the Ming political system with very few changes. The most obvious difference, though, was that the Manchus were ethnically and culturally different from their subject population. And the Qin dealt with this in two ways. First, the Qin tried to preserve their distinct identity within Chinese society. The Manchus, who made up only 2% of the entire population, were defined legally as distinct from everyone else in China. The Manchu nobility kept their aristocratic privileges, and their economic base was protected by large landholdings and revenues provided from the state treasury. Other Manchus were given farmland and were organized into military units called banners, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Also, we see them trying their best to actually work with their Chinese subjects, and they stress their devotion to Confucianism, which was a Chinese belief system that had been used as official state policy by the majority of the Chinese dynasties for many, many centuries. So some of the Manchus were organized into military units called banners. They were stationed as separate units in various strategic positions throughout China. These bannermen were the chief fighting force of the empire. The Chinese citizens served in the Green Standard Army, and the Green Standard Army basically served as a local police force, and they were stationed all throughout China, and they worked along with the bannermen. The second way in which the Qin dealt with the problem of ethnic and cultural differences was to bring Chinese into the top ranks of the imperial administration. They created a system known as a diarchy, in which all important government positions were shared equally by Chinese and Manchus. For example, of the 6 members of the Grand Secretariat, which was an advisory council, 3 were Manchu and 3 were Chinese. Manchus and Chinese also shared responsibilities at the provincial level. Provincial governors were usually Chinese, but 2 provinces would quite often be linked under a governor-general who was a Manchu. The willingness of the Manchus to share power won the support of many of the Chinese people. At the same time, many of the Manchus themselves increasingly became part of Chinese civilization. Members of the Qin dynasty also tried to establish that they were China's rightful rulers. They did this by stressing their devotion to the principles of Confucianism. Emperor Kanchi, for example, studied the sacred Confucian classics. He issued a sacred edict that proclaimed to the empire the importance of the moral values established by Confucius. So who was Confucius? And why were his ideas important? He had lived in the 6th century BC. He believed that the common good was what was important. He lived during a time of civil war, a period when Chinese society was tearing itself apart. And so a lot of his ideas are based on what was going on during his lifetime. And he believed that people, citizens, should work to improve society. So, your job as a citizen of China is to do whatever you can to make your society better. He believed that if you're going to hold a government job, you should earn it through merit. So it's not something you should be given because of your position in society. And at the top of society, you have the king. Well, according to Confucius, it was up to the king to set a good example of behavior. If he did so, the people would follow. So these are the principles by which the Chinese had lived for many centuries, and the Manchu continue with this. They don't come in and just shut it down, wipe it away. They continue with this practice. In some ways, China was at the height of its power and glory in the mid-18th century. But it was also under Qianlong that the first signs of the internal decay of the Qin dynasty began to appear. Qin military campaigns along the frontier cost a lot of money, and in turn placed huge demands on the treasury. As the emperor grew older, he became less careful in choosing his officials, and he fell under the influence of corrupt elements at court. With increasing frequency, these corrupt elements, these officials, took funds intended for military use, and in doing that, angered military officials. So we see a breakdown. We see higher taxes. They've got to pay for all of this somehow. So taxes are continually being raised and raised. We see corrupt officials again, which leads to unrest in the countryside. At the same time, there's a growing pressure on the land because of population growth. And this leads to economic hardship for a lot of peasants. They just can't afford to feed their families or to live. The heart of the unrest was located in central China. In central China, unhappy peasants who had recently been settled on some very poor farmland launched a revolt known as the White Lotus Rebellion. And this rebellion lasted for 8 years, from 1796 to 1804. It was a sign that there were a lot of unhappy subjects. And eventually the revolt was suppressed, but it cost a lot of money because the military had to be enlarged, had to be sent to put this rebellion down. It was a huge expense. And it was also a warning that the glory years of the Manchus were ending. Unfortunately for China, the Qin dynasty was declining just as Europe was putting pressure on China for more trade. The first conflict had come from the north, where Russian traders wanted to trade for skins and furs. Formal diplomatic relations between China and Russia were established in 1689 and provided for regular trade between the two countries. 40 years later, a new treaty confirmed Chinese rule over all of Mongolia in return for formal trading rights and a permanent residence for Russian merchants in Beijing. Dealing with the foreigners who arrived by sea, however, was a bit more difficult. By the end of the 17th century, the English had replaced the Portuguese as the dominant force in European trade in Asia. The Qin maintained the Ming policy of restricting foreign traders, but the Europeans kept pressing them to open new cities for trade. They just were not satisfied. In 1793, Lord Macartney arrived in China at the head of a British diplomatic mission. He brought samples of British-made goods to show the Chinese the advantage of trade with the Westerners. The Chinese thought the goods were gifts offered as tribute to the emperor, and they thought that they were just pretty crudely made. And then there were misunderstandings that followed, even more. For example, the Chinese told Macartney that he would have to perform the traditional kowtow. That means that when he came into the presence of the emperor, he would have to bow to the floor and touch his head to the ground to show his respect for the emperor. Macartney refused. He also offended the Chinese by speaking of the natural superiority of the English, which, if you think about it, isn't real brilliant if you're trying to deal with these people, but it resulted in the negotiations faltering. In the end, Macartney was received, but the meeting didn't really accomplish anything. Ultimately, though, finally, trade with China will be established. Operating through the East India Company, which served as both a trading unit and the administrator of English territories in Asia, the English established their first trading outpost in the city of Canton in 1699. Over the next decades, trade with China, and especially the export of tea and silk to England, increased rapidly. At first, the Qin government granted trade privileges to the Europeans in exchange for periodic payments to the government at Beijing. Eventually, though, the Qin rulers adopted a new system. To limit contacts between Europeans and Chinese, the Qin confined all European traders to a small island just outside the city walls of Canton. Also, the traders could live there only from October through March, and they could only deal with a limited number of Chinese firms licensed by the government. For a while, the British accepted the system. They're like, okay, we'll work with it. And they did this because it's bringing a lot of profit to the East India Company. However, by the end of the 18th century, some of the British traders wanted more. They began to demand access to cities other than Canton along the Chinese coast. At the same time, the Chinese government was under pressure from merchants to open China to British manufactured goods. In 1791, a British mission visited Beijing to press for the liberalization of trade restrictions. But Emperor Qianlong didn't have any interest in British products. As the emperor noted in a letter to King George III, China has no need of your country's manufacturers. And unfortunately for the Chinese, they will later pay for their rejection of the British request. At the time, though, the emperor's attitude, Qianlong's attitude, seemed justified by China's successes because they were doing well for the most part. Qianlong figured that he already ruled the world's greatest empire. Why did they need to deal with these outsiders? In the long run, though, his policy proved disastrous. Even then, there was a lot that the Chinese could have learned from the West. And in the 1880s, China will learn about Western advances, especially in military technology, the hard way. And just looking ahead a bit, when we get to the new imperialism, we will see the impact that the Europeans and their desire for trade will have on China. And we'll see how China is forced to trade with the Europeans.